This past week, I was contacted by RTE Primetime. Believe it or not, they reached out to me and asked me would I like to come on the show to give my reaction to the government's introduction of these new changes, these reforms to the rental system. Now, I said I would come on, and then they called me back a little bit later to say that unfortunately their first choice, which was a little bit of a letdown, but their first choice was Michael O'Flynn, the very big developer based in Cork. And fair enough, I kind of thought to myself, well, he's got a big profile, and he's a good speaker, and so my debut on national television is going to have to wait until the next time. And that's fair enough too. In fairness to Michael O'Flynn, he did a great job giving his reaction to the changes and the reforms and stuff. And given he's one of the largest developers in the country, he was a good choice to bring on. However, I will say, I do think that there was a voice missing in the discussion. They also brought on government minister, and they had somebody from UCD who was an expert in housing policy and stuff like that. I think that they were missing a voice from the landlord side of things. If you think about the small average landlord, like I'm talking about a person who owns one or two rental properties, not large, but they represent the largest cohort of landlords in the country. And there was nobody there speaking on their behalf. Michael O'Flynn is a big developer. He's building lots of apartments and houses and stuff, and he's selling them on. He's not a person who's actually renting them out. So I think from that point of view, we were missing a key voice in the debate. So today I'm going to be doing that. I'm going to be giving you my view and what I would have probably said had I been given the opportunity. And I'm going to try to explain why these changes matter to landlords, why they matter to tenants, and why they matter to anyone who literally is paying rent at the moment. I'm also going to cover the big risks that no one is talking about. So let's get into it, okay? First things first, what has changed? So what has changed is the government in the past week, it unveiled these reforms, major reforms to the rental sector. And it's aimed at extending rent caps nationwide. Okay, so there are currently, as of today, there were rent caps in various towns and cities around the country. We all know that. They were called the RPZ, the rent pressure zones. And most people who are living in Dublin are in a rent pressure zone if you're renting. And then there was parts of the country that were outside of this. And back in February or March, I think it was, there was rumblings that this was possibly going to be abolished. So I did an episode on that a couple of months back, and I was saying that this could be a good thing because it definitely needs to be reformed. Then in the last month or so, we found that the town of Tullow in County Carlow and Castlebar had just been added to the rent pressure zone. So it was now, those two towns were now inside the rent pressure zone system, whereas they had been outside of it. And this confused me because I was thinking, hold on a sec, they were talking about abolishing it. And now all of a sudden, here we are with two more towns added to it. So it's created a bit of confusion. And then in the last week or so, the word got out that this was coming. And on Tuesday of this past week, the 10th of June, I believe, they announced this. It is aimed at extending the rent cap nationwide to protect tenants, but also they say that what they want to do is they want to incentivize landlords to stay in the market, and they want to encourage apartment development. Now, I can understand these are key aims, and so it's most definitely important that they do try to meet these three aims. The first one, the key one, I would say, and it's very contentious element, is this new provision that is going to allow landlords to reset their rents to the prevailing market rate after 6 years of tenancy, or after a tenant leaves of their own volition. So if a tenant is living in your property and then let's say they've gone and they bought another house and they're going to move into that house and they say, thank you, Mr. Landlord, we're going to give you back the keys. Now, this is exactly what I did myself in June of 2023. Moved out of a rented place I'd been living in for 6 years and moved into my own home, which I am now making this video from. So the situation, though, is that when the tenant moves out, up until the point where they move out or to the end of the 6 years, there is the cap of 2% that currently applies will continue to apply, or to inflation if it happens to be lower. Now, at the moment, inflation is running higher than 2%, so it doesn't really apply. But this applies to RPZs. And now, because RPZs have been extended to the entire country, everyone is under this same rule. Now, that is something that is going to create a bit of confusion and fear, I guess, in a lot of landlords that are down in rural parts of the country. If you haven't had to worry about the RPZ up until now, all of a sudden you'll be scratching your head wondering, what is this? What are these new rules? And I think that is going to create a little bit of fear in the landlord sector, certainly in the areas that are outside of the RPZ. Like those of us in Dublin and in the bigger cities and stuff, we've been dealing with this for the past, I think it came out in 2016 or 2014. So it's like we've been dealing with it for nearly a decade, if not more than a decade. Here we are all of a sudden being told that these rules now apply to everybody. So I think it's going to make a few people a little bit worried. And it's going to be a bit of a shock to landlords who thought that this was going to be abolished. And here it is, not just abolished, but extended through the entire country. Now, a key difference in all of this is that from the 1st of March next year, 2026, landlords can adjust the rent back to the prevailing market rate. So that's going to mean adjust the rent up. Because as I experienced myself, when I lived in my property in Blackrock for those 6 years, I moved into the place. I had a really lovely landlord, and she didn't increase my rent once in 6 years. I moved in, and I think I was paying $2,250 a month. And I was paying that it was around about the time my daughter Erica was born. So it was, I think I moved in March of 2017. And I moved in, and that rent never went up in the 6 years that I was living there. Now, it's crucial that I voluntarily left. In these new rules, you will not be able to force a rent increase by pushing the tenant out. That is not going to be permitted. It is only going to be where a tenant decides that they're leaving for their own reasons. And so evictions are being removed. That is one of the big changes here. You will not be allowed to evict a tenant for any reason going forward. Well, you will be allowed for like breach of contract. So if a tenant stops paying rent, that's obviously a breach. If a tenant was to have, let's say, 15 people living in the house or the apartment, and you had said that it was only for 2 3 of you or whatever it is. Like there's certain things that are clearly a breach that would allow you to evict the tenant. But there used to be a thing called no fault evictions, where if a landlord wanted to sell a property, or if they wanted to do some refurbishment work to the property, or whatever it might be, if they wanted to move a family member into the property, that was a no fault eviction. And you would serve it on the tenant, and the tenant would move out after the stated period. Usually it was something like 6 months notice. Now, in this case, that's gone, and this no fault evictions will be removed. The only case where they will be allowed is if you're moving one of your own kids into the property. So it has to be a direct family member. It cannot be kind of a distant cousin or something like that, which would have been kind of the excuse that people would use if they wanted to do this. The other exception where it's allowed is in the event that you yourself are going through severe hardship or something like that. So let's say, for example, you own a home and a rental property and you've just been made redundant. Maybe you put your property on the market and sell it, and you think, you know what, I'll move into the smaller rental property and I'll just live there and I'll get myself back on my feet financially. That's a hardship case, and that is permitted. The government has argued that these overhauls are going to boost investment in the rental market, with landlords now able to reset rents. And it's also at the same time, it's giving tenants this new minimum duration of 6 years where they cannot be removed. Now that I can see that as a good thing, because when a landlord decides, let's just move this guy on, it creates massive disruption in the life of a tenant. I know when I was living in the house in Blackrock, while I was there, the landlord at one stage, and I got on very, very well, but at one stage I can remember the agent for her approaching me and saying that the nephew was moving back to Dublin and needed a place to stay, and had asked her could he stay there, and so she was asking me would I mind moving on and somewhere else, and we started looking around for a place to rent, and it was exceptionally difficult. And I can remember just going back to the guy and saying, this is not on, this is really, really difficult to, you can't find anywhere in the local area, and if we do find somewhere in the local area, it's like 500 or 600 a month more. So in the end, they relented and they just said, you know what, we'll just tell the nephew to go away and find something himself. And so the pressure was off, and we ended up staying there for another 3 or 4 years. But this extension now of 6 years, I think that's probably a good thing from the perspective of a tenant. You now know that you can lay down roots for at least 6 years, and that gives you maybe a time to go and see if maybe I'm going to move into the area, maybe I'll start looking for a house to buy in that area, whatever it might be. Now, the situation is changing, and it's a delicate balancing act, okay? And I get that. You can never please everyone all of the time. On paper, this balancing act appears to have been achieved. But if you scratch beneath the surface, a whole lot of ambiguity exists and confusion starts to rise. And that's where we need to look at the media focus from the primetime show. Now, Miriam O'Callaghan, who's a great interviewer, she was speaking with Michael O'Flynn, the developer I mentioned. And I got to give credit to Michael. I think he did a great job representing the development community. Now, I'm in the development community as well as I'm part of a house building company. But, he is at the coalface doing a lot of big projects around the country and stuff like that. So he made a couple of key points, and they are as follows. Number one, supply must be viable before it can be funded. And he is of the view that there are quite a lot of locations where developments are just not viable financially, economically. He said the building regulations that govern the apartment development, they are very, very restrictive. Now, he didn't say that we should have no restrictions or no regulations, but he said that there was some reforms needed to that. And he was saying that you have developments that are unprofitable because of the cost of putting that building in place. And it's funny, I was speaking with my own members of the accelerator the other day. We were just talking about this, and one of them is a small builder, and he was of the view that he used the metaphor of buying a car. If you were going out into the market to buy a car, you have a choice between buying a Toyota or a Ford or a BMW or a Mercedes, or if you've got lots and lots of money, you can go and buy a Rolls Royce. The point being, you have a choice of purchase price. But the problem is with the building regulations, when it comes to building apartments, there's a huge amount of rules and regulations around the size and around the facilities and around even things like they have to be dual aspect. They have to have windows in one direction and in another completely alternative direction. And all of this adds to the cost. If you compare some apartments in different cities, like if you go and look at the Netherlands or Paris, the apartments there are much, much smaller than the minimum size of our apartments. And so those would be ways that you could maybe get the price down. And this is what he was kind of talking about. He also mentioned the fact that there's VAT on all houses and apartments that are built. That's 13.5% on top of the construction price. So all of this makes it less viable. And so that is something that needs to be worked on. Another thing he mentioned was the planning process. And this is something that we've been talking about for years. The planning process is probably the worst in Europe. We have a system that is just takes forever. And I know of projects that have taken 4 years, 5 years to actually go from start to actually having a decision. And the worst thing is, at the end of those 4 years or 5 years, the decision can actually be against you and you're back to square one, despite having spent a lot of money on professionals and applications and all that. And these big schemes that are done, they're not just simply a load of drawings that are submitted. There's studies, there's all sorts of like environmental research that has to go on. That all costs tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, to put those applications together. You go through all of that process, you have multiple professionals engaged in the process, and at the end of 3, 4, 5 years, you have a decision that is, sorry, you can't build this development as per what you've submitted, and you're back to the very beginning. And so you can see why there is so much reform needed. There's also this thing where people can object. A single individual, not even living in the area, can object to a development, and that development can be delayed for years because of one person deciding that they don't like the idea of it. And there's all sorts of scope there for people to actually be essentially, corrupting the process and going in and saying, listen, if you want me to remove my thing, it's going to cost you a few quid. And we have seen that happen. There was I think it was in one of the RTE shows where they reported on this. Also, there's a lot of zoned land around the country that is not actually ready, shovel ready as we would call it. Being zoned is one thing. You've got land that is unzoned and you can't do anything on it. But then you have zoned land where theoretically you could go and build whatever you want on it. The problem with zoned land is it needs to be serviced zoned land. You have to have water, you have to have power, you have to have sewer. And if you don't have those things, if they're not connected to the mains, then you cannot build on that site. And so all of these things slow down what could be otherwise a development. So Michael O'Flynn, he concluded that while these reforms are a step in the right direction, they will not lead to a dramatic increase in the supply of housing. And he said that that is only going to be possible after a suite of other measures are included in the overall reforms that the government is talking about. Now, following on from Michael O'Flynn speaking, Miriam's colleague, Sarah McInerney, I think it is, Sarah was interviewing the TD and Minister of State for Local Government and Planning. John Cummings is his name. And he came in and he said that, yes, balance is what they were trying to achieve. And I can understand, like, the government's in a difficult place insofar as trying to kind of keep everyone happy, because you have the opposition parties saying that they've caved to the developers and that they've caved to the landlords. But the reality is that the developers and the landlords are not happy either. We didn't get enough to make these projects really viable. And so you're never going to make all of them happy. But while he was talking about trying to achieve balance and stuff, Sarah McInerney pushed back, accusing the government of simply not listening. And if anything, the reforms that were introduced are likely to push landlords out. I think she's probably right there. And I think that's where it was missing, having somebody to speak for the landlord side of it. Now, one of my colleagues in the accelerator, Mary Conway, she's chairperson of the Irish Property Owners Association. I've had her on the podcast, and Mary is often brought in to kind of argue this. And so I've spoken to Mary about these changes, and she says it is a bit of a disaster at the moment. She says there's an awful lot of confusion and ambiguity about it, and it would have been great to either have Mary there, or if I had been there, or at least somebody to give this viewpoint, because there is, according to the RTB, the Residential Tenancy Board, 86% of all landlords in the country only own between 1 and 2 properties. 86%. So the small landlord is by far the largest represents the largest segment of the market. And so these are small individual owners. These are not property moguls. These are nurses. These are electricians, carpenters. These are people that are just simply thinking, I don't want to put my money in the stock market. I would rather buy a house and I'll rent that house. And that is my form of retirement planning. That's the way it is thought of. So a lot of people love to kind of jump on the vulture funds and the fact that, they call them cuckoo funds and all of this kind of stuff. And I can see that being very, very unpopular because they're the big corporates that come in and they buy up a whole segment of a housing estate or a huge apartment development or whatever. But those big funds, they're investing billions in the country, and the big developers, the economics, because we talked about the planning and the building regulations and all of these kind of requirements, a lot of building apartments do not make economic sense. To give you an example, if it costs something like 400,000 is the average cost price of building an apartment per apartment in a large development. And if you consider, there are some parts of the country where the maximum price that would be achieved for an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, would be maybe 275, 290,000, but it would cost 400,000 to build it. And so that is something that's really, really important. That is why you don't see apartment buildings going up all over the country. They're only going to go up in places where the land prices are actually going to make it economically viable. And so the big funds, those are the guys that come along and they don't buy based on the price. They buy based on the income that can be generated from the asset. And so those guys they only represent 6 to 8% of the total private rental stock. And that is mostly Dublin and Cork. And they're unlikely to buy outside of those two cities. But they're very big. They have very big footprints inside of the city. So it's estimated that the big funds own now between 25 and 30,000 apartments in the Dublin and, say, Cork area. So the small landlord is kind of being overlooked. Like those changes that are being introduced, the only exception is new build apartments. So the big developers that are building new builds, they're selling it to the big funds. The big funds are buying it and they will not be restricted by the 2% cap. They will be allowed to increase rents to whatever the going inflation is. And that is a big benefit to them because they just want to make sure that they're getting a return on their investment. But the small landlord, we don't get any of those benefits that the big funds are getting. So that ambiguity is going to create concern and fear and worry. And when people are concerned and when people are confused, they tend to vote with their feet. They tend to head for the exit because if they don't know what the likelihood of the future is, they would rather just get their money while they know they can get their money. Now, as I mentioned, I lived 6 years in a property in Blackrock, and the very nice landlord, that landlady that I had, she never increased my rent. So let's just do the maths, okay? 2,250 per month. That was my rent. And she would have only been allowed to increase it by 2% per year. 2% per year. So when I left after 6 years, she would be able to increase, like she didn't increase it once during my time there, but at the end of the 6 years, she would be entitled to catch up. So that would be 2% every year for a period of 6 years. So let's say approximately 12%. If it's going up by 2% every year, it's probably going to be more than 12%. But that equates to just a €284 a month increase. You're talking about it going from 2,250 a month to 2,534 a month. That would be the increase that she was entitled to. Now, I can tell you, having gone back and looked at the area, the minimum that you can rent that same property today is about 3,500, if not 4,000, because there's just so few of them around that the landlords that are there that are not under these restrictions, they can basically go and charge whatever they want, and there will be people who will pay it. So it's now unclear with all of these new rules is what does it mean to reset your rent? Does that mean that I can reset my rent to the 3,500 on the 1st of March 2026? Because I think that's what people are perceiving it to mean. That's what they're interpreting it to mean. And so, because what I've heard in the past couple of days is that Across the country, there have been eviction notices served left, right, and centre. And because of that, people want to be in a position that in March of next year, they can start a new lease, and that new lease will allow the clock to begin on this whole process, whereas at the moment it's kind of ambiguous. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out. But let's just work that one through. If you were to look at 2026 as the beginning of this, and you have 6 years, that means the earliest you can look at a reset is 2032. That's a long wait. Like, if you're renting your property at $1,000 a month, less than what it could be achieving, and you have to wait until 2032 till you can get it up to that rate, that does not look like much of an incentive to me. I would think most people would say, you know what, let's just sell it and let's just get out. And I think that's what people are doing. Now, the alternative to that, an option is to move the tenant out and leave it vacant for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, you can move it to a reset to the market level. So when a landlord decides, you know what, I'm putting this property on the market, who buys it? It tends not to be another landlord. It tends to be a family that are looking for their forever home. There's an awful lot of people out there trying to find property. They're all bidding against one another. It's not landlords bidding against, owners, because owners tend to be emotionally attached to the property, so they'll pay more. And so you end up with that property going to an owner-occupier, and it gets removed from the property system. If it's removed from the rental system, what does that mean? One less property to rent in that area. Now, somebody said, yeah, but isn't this what the government wants? They want to, leave this for the families. But I would turn around and say, well, hold on a second. I was renting for 6 years. Am I not a family? Am I not entitled to have a house that I can rent? Is my only option that I have to buy? And I don't think that's a great option. So I don't think that's the plan. I think it's really just to give tenants a little bit of certainty. But what they've done now is they've created uncertainty for landlords around what the 6 years means. So let us assume we sign a tenancy on the 1st of March next year, 2026. And let's say you're okay with the idea of renting this long term. Like, I rented a property to the same man for about 17 years. And in that period of time, he paid me so much rent that it actually more than paid for the whole house. And it was a great thing. But it suited me. I had a great tenant at the time, and it just suited me to do that. But let's say you're okay with the idea of doing this for a couple of years, and then 2 or 3 years in, you say, uh-oh, something's changed. Something in my life is now making me to reconsider this. Maybe I'm moving abroad. Maybe you get married and your wife wants to move back home to another country or something like that. There may be a reason for you to decide to sell it. What are you going to be selling now? You're going to be selling a house with a tenant who has 6 years of guaranteed tenancy, which means that tenant cannot be moved out for you to sell the property. You will have to sell the property with an in situ tenant. Now, if you're selling a property with a tenant in situ, most people will tell you, do not touch it, because you're buying it and you're buying all the headaches that come with it. Now, you might have a really, really nice tenant, but you don't know. The other thing, though, is that the vast majority of people who are buying, they're buying it for themselves. And so if you're sort of looking to buy a house and you say, oh, there's an in situ tenant, that's it. It's not for us. The bank will not lend us money for a rental property. They'll lend it to us for our home. So there's going to be all of these issues. If you want to sell that property, you're stuck and you're caught now in this 6-year restriction. So the big question is going to be, who's going to want to buy those homes if there's a tenant in situ? It's only going to be open to other landlords. So you're immediately going to be removing the entire owner-occupier, interested party from the pool of buyers that are possibly looking at buying your property. So I think that's going to change the dynamic quite a lot. And I see a lot of people looking at that right now saying, don't like the idea of that, let's sell the property. And so I think that's what's possibly triggered this slew of evictions that were announced, or not announced, but that I've heard about in the last couple of days. I've heard at least 30 to 40. So that gives you an idea. That's a lot of evictions in just 1 week. And it's all triggered because of the reforms. So a lot of people spooked. And I'd say both landlords and tenants. I'd say tenants that are getting this eviction notice to move out, like I'd say they're wondering what on earth, why is this all being triggered? Last April 2024, I recorded an episode. It was episode 204 if you want to look it up. And I talked about the unintended consequences when governments introduce changes to housing policy. And I talked about how cities like New York, they introduced changes themselves and it had all these unintended consequences. There is other cities around the world, like Sweden and various places. Go and listen to that episode. But I mentioned how a decision made by government for the right reasons triggered consequences that actually really detrimentally impacted that sector. And this is what potentially I think is going to happen here. So the RTB, they are now the Residential Tenancies Board. There's a lot of complaints about it at the moment. I think the big problem is that they are under-resourced. They are trying to deal with all of the landlords in the country. I think there's 130,000 small landlords in the country. The RTB are trying to manage all of this. You have to register every single year. So that's 130,000 registrations every year. The RTB is now being charged with managing and enforcing this new policy, these reforms. So it's their job to police it and to enforce it. And I got to ask, are they equipped to handle this? Like already there's massive delays because they're under-resourced. They've just had the entire country now fall under their remit. And in addition to that, these changes with 6 years and, what's a rental increase that's going to be permitted, what's bringing it to market rent, all of this kind of stuff. I wonder, is the RPZ system going to come under enormous pressure because the RTB are just not able to kind of keep up with all of this. They're having a massive increase in the geographic area that they cover, and that's going to be a lot of new properties falling in under their remit. And it's also going to be these new changes that they have to now interpret, and they have to start kind of defending tenants and landlords and whatever. So who are the winners and losers? I have a couple of concerns here. On the one hand, these reforms, they have gone too far. They've made all these changes that are going to make everyone freak out. But on the other hand, these changes don't go far enough. Like, we're not actually going to see an increase in supply because there is too many barriers, too many hurdles in the way of increasing supply. You could say that the developers are a winner in this, and the big investment institutions and the funds are certainly winners in this because now they have that 2% cap removed and they can go with inflation. So they've won something for sure in this. And that certainly will bring big funds back into the country. And so developers will find projects that they can pre-sell to a fund, and that's going to be good. But the reforms don't go far enough insofar as they do not make a serious dent in the supply constraints that are holding back house building and stuff. We talked about the planning issue. We talked about the zoning issue. We have cost issues. There's also capacity issues. All you have to do is take a look at the age of tradespeople in the country. The average age of plumbers, electricians and plumbers, the average age is now 45 across the country. That's because it's no longer that attractive to get into the trades. Whereas back in the 80s, when I was a kid, a lot of my friends, they left school right after not the junior cert, it was called the intercert back then. They left school at 14, 15, 16, whatever age they were. They did the exam. Most of them flunked it, went and they said, okay, I'm going to become a tradesperson. Or they went and they worked with their dad or their uncle or whatever as an apprentice. That's the system that it was back then. Nowadays, none of that really is seen as an avenue to making a living. There will be a few, but it's not in the numbers that it used to be. And that being the case, we have a major problem with trades are being hollowed out. That means that we have capacity issues. You can't get enough trades. And to bring the tradespeople into the country from abroad, you don't have a housing system that will actually support the inward journey that these guys are trying to make. So who are the losers in this? I think small landlords definitely are a loser in this. Yes, you can reset the rent after 6 years, but I think all of these restrictions make it quite inflexible. And I think a lot of people are going to fear that. I also think rural areas are going to suffer because so many landlords will decide just to sell up rather than take on a person and have them locked in for 6 years. And in a rural setting, you can be sure there will not be a landlord that steps in to buy those properties. So once that landlord stops renting a place in a rural area, that's it. It's gone. I don't think that property is coming back. So it'll be sold to an owner-occupier or whatever. So what would I have said had I been given my 5 minutes of fame on primetime? I would have said, yes, there is a crisis of supply, but this one tweak is just not going to fix it. We need major reforms to the overall housing supply system. We need to overhaul the planning system, like absolutely overhaul it. Trades need to become more attractive to young people. We need to reduce the cost of building regulations, maybe reduce those minimum dimensions of apartments, reduce some of the restrictions on how many windows and directions that you can have in a building. We need to zone more land, and we need to make sure that that land is serviced in a timely way. And I do think what would make a big difference is to reintroduce the in-house professional teams that local authorities used to have so that they could actually develop themselves. It used to be, and we were talking about this in my group the other day, that back in the 90s and stuff, anytime you were looking, if you were a builder or a quantity surveyor or anything, there was this constant stream of work where the local authority would buy a site and they would employ builders to go in, and they'd have their own teams run the job, and the job would be complete, and then that would be it. You'd have those houses would come on the market and it would be owned by the local council. So that's gone. Those local authorities have been hollowed out. There is no capability, and so they have to outsource all of that now. And that means that you're basically competing with the private side, and the only way the local authority can get social housing and affordable housing into their system is by forcing the developers to give them the 20%. Small landlords are a key element to fixing this crisis. So I think the government should stop throwing sand in the gears, and I think they should tax incentivize being a landlord. I think if you're going to introduce this 6-year thing, I think you have to introduce some sort of tax breaks or some sort of incentives to make landlords feel like it's worth staying in and taking these restrictions. In closing, I think we really are playing with fire here. The government needed to be seen to be doing something, and I get it. But I think tweaking around the edges is just not going to fix it. I just don't get a sense that there is any urgency in this. Like, I'm sure there is urgency, but I don't see the urgency. I don't see them acting on it. Anytime you go and make an application for a planning, the thing is just delayed for months and months and months. There's no sense that we've got to turn this thing around and get this back to the developer in 8 weeks. It could be months before anything is done. And so I think we've known about the planning delays and stuff like that for 10 years. Why is it we're still talking about them? That could have been fixed a long time ago. So I would love to hear your view. What do you guys think? If you're a landlord, how do you feel about these reforms? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? And if you're a tenant, same question. What do you think about it? And then the big question I have is for those of you out there that are doing short-term rentals. Like if you're doing Airbnb, if you're doing rent-to-rent, any of that kind of stuff, the government is coming after you. Like I've heard that they're basically saying there will be no short-term rentals once this system is put in. So that's going to make a lot of you guys a bit worried. Those of you who are getting a good rent from an Airbnb or whatever, let me know your thoughts. Love to hear from you. Leave it a comment down below, and I will catch you in the next one. Thanks a mil.